Hello and welcome once again to The Booking Club, the podcast that brings you today's leading authors and commentators from a table at their favourite places to eat and drink. I'm your host, Jack Aldane. On this episode, I'm going to be speaking to James Bloodworth, author of Lost Boys, a personal journey through the Manosphere. James, it's great to finally meet you. I've followed your work for many years now. I half wondered whether you might choose a certain Starbucks in Leicester Square to do this, because that's where the book begins, isn't it? It takes us back to 2006, when you were aged about 18, I think.
No, it was a bit older. I was mentally probably 18, but I was actually 23 at that time.
And a fully signed up member to the then Manosphere, as it was before things really took off online.
That's right, and thanks for having me. I would have probably chosen Starbucks, but it doesn't exist there anymore. It's gone. And also Tiger was the nightclub, which I kind of ventured into with my first kind of experience at the Manosphere on this pickup bootcamp in 2006. Tiger's recently closed, so here we are. But yeah, that was my first. I mean, my first encounter with the Manosphere was online, the forums. But then I kind of got lured in, persuaded, if you like, to take one of these boot camps to spend. I had £2,000 from. I had some money kind of knocking around from. I had a car accident actually, and it was the other person's fault. And then I had some kind of money from the insurance for that. So I had £2,000 kicking around. I thought, oh, maybe I'll use this to try and fix my dating life.
To try and fix another car crash.
Threw it at that, yeah.
Well, listen, you've already begun there to tell us the backstory to all of this, but it's fascinating and something I wasn't aware of before picking up the book. The fact that, you were already a part of, as I say, the prototype Manosphere that existed before things really took off a decade later online. So you've already spoken a little bit about how you first got the money in order to pay for one of these exorbitantly expensive gurus to come meet you in public and train you, as it were, to take advantage of the moment and approach women as you hadn't previously had the courage to do. But where was your life at that point before deciding to become part of the pickup community? Because presumably this would have been way before you even had clear ambitions to become a journalist, and where the thought of writing about something like this wouldn't have occurred to you. You were in it. You were not looking at it. You were part of this phenomenon. Yeah,
and it was the way I approached it at the time was, I was interested in writing. Like, I did like writing. But this was like a private thing. I didn't want any of my friends to know about. It was, so I was, at the time, 22 when I first discovered the pickup forums. I was living in Somerset, in a fairly rural town in Somerset with my grandmother. And kind of after school, I had friends. We didn't go out that much. They weren't exactly like Casanovas or anything either. And I spent a lot of time at home reading, smoking weed. My social skills kind of atrophied after school. I was kind of happy in other respects. So I moved in with my grandmother when I was 16, and basically, like, she was the closest. I was closer to her than like my mum, and I never met my dad. And so it's kind of a weird setup in some people's eyes, perhaps. But I was happy. But socially awkward, yeah. And
did you ever speak to your grandmother about this?
Yeah, I mean, my gran used the word courting for, are you courting anyone, James? So it was just difficult because she was kind of, her view was like, oh, it just kind of takes care of itself. It's like from a different era. And like well-meaning advice, like you'll meet someone at some point.
Although to be fair to her, you were presumably asking this advice when face-to-face contact was still the main medium through which you met someone. Now, a grandparent could be forgiven for not having the tools to really give even preliminary advice about this. The world we live in now
is completely different,
substantially different. In the mid-2000s, when you and I were both young men, the rules of courting did still apply to some degree, didn't they? Yeah,
they definitely did. And my gran used to say that stuff to me, and it was reassuring because she kind of created a safe space where there was no pressure on, I wasn't doing a lot with my life at that point, and my gran didn't put loads of pressure on me, but it was like she had kind of a faith that I would sort myself out in the end. So that kind of played into the dating aspects as well. But I also felt like I needed more help. And that was how I found these kind of gurus on the internet. The thing that was different then from now with regard to dating apps was, back then you could kind of protect your ego a bit more. So I could kind of tell myself, well, if I did want to meet someone, I'd be able to do it. I could kind of kid myself. Oh, well, if I did want to meet someone, I'd be able to. Whereas I think that's harder now when the bar to kind of put yourself out there is lower. So with a dating app, you can just kind of set up a profile, but the kind of the quantity of rejection is potentially higher because you can go online and potentially you set up your profile. It's not very good. The photos you've taken are not very good, and you can get kind of a bunch of rejections, quote unquote rejections, in a very short period of time, and that could, especially as a like teenage boy or woman, that can affect your self-esteem, I think, which I was kind of shielded. We were kind of shielded from that a bit more, I think, at that time, that pre-dating apps, pre-social media.
Yes, before
those judgments.
Before we were all a brand, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly.
I think you subsisted on what you imagined somebody else's memory of you to have been in real time and real space. If something didn't quite work out, but anything that goes wrong now is in ink. Look, this book had to be written eventually and sooner rather than later, and I'm glad that somebody has done it. And actually, I'll say this, I'm glad that you've done it, because based on your previous work, The Myth of Meritocracy, Why Working Class Kids Still Get Working Class Jobs, and especially Hired, 6 months undercover in low-wage Britain, somebody who was willing, to go into the field, meet people face-to-face, was always going to be essential to getting this right. And also somebody, I think, who fundamentally understood the plight of the most vulnerable in society, or took a keen interest in that, was also important. And whether it's low-wage workers or vulnerable young men who get sucked into the manosphere and who then, by their own faults, become part of the problem, which is something we'll talk about later on, as opposed to pure victims of it, you've managed, I think, to capture the effects and a lot of the causes behind it. But first of all, tell us, what do most people, do you think, not understand or simply get wrong about the manosphere?
I'd say that the thing that most people probably get wrong about it is that it is this kind of quite disparate group of people. It's not, not necessarily the gurus and the entrepreneurs and the hucksters who are just out to make money from like insecure men or male insecurity. I think or resentment. I think it's just the actual manosphere itself, like the kind of the clients who are kind of the clients or the pay pigs or the marks or whatever like pejorative term people want to use. I think that realm is like made up of like lots of different kinds of people, and partly I'd say that I'm biased because I was one of those people, so I'm obviously less inclined to condemn everyone as kind of just some kind of predator or loser or something, because I never really felt like I was coming at it from that place. But it's a lot of the people find the manosphere, like a lot of people find like radical ideology in general, because there's a vacuum there. They're looking for answers. There's some pre-existing vulnerability or sense of confusion. And then they stumble across a bunch of people who have this sense of certainty and have this roadmap, which maybe that can be quite compelling. If you don't come from a place where you know what the answers are, someone who's kind of, pertains to have all of the answers, says that they kind of, they have a lot of charisma or something, and they have this roadmap, it can be very attractive to you. And that's not obviously just the manosphere. And
that's where we should probably rewind to when you were a member of the pickup community. Were the men that you saw in that room then substantially different from the men that we see online today?
I wouldn't say it's changed completely in terms of the clients who are attracted to it, because I spent time during the book in Las Vegas in 2023, and a lot of the clients I met there were kind of similar to some of the guys I'd met 20 years ago.
Right.
I'd say some of there's people come to the manosphere now with more preconceived ideas about women and feminism, which are much darker than some of the guys I'd come across back when I got into the pickup scene. So it's more overtly political, more overtly conspiratorial. Many of those people I met on the course in 2023 would kind of shoehorn things about conspiracy theories about COVID into the conversations. They'd have a very kind of negative view of things like feminism off the bat, a very politicized view of that. Whereas back in 2005, 2006, there was always this undercurrent of misogyny. Like, I don't want to kind of let that stuff off the hook. There was always this undercurrent of manipulation and objectification. But there was also, it wasn't very political. There wasn't kind of like, it wasn't about getting back at women in this political way. It was very much about, like, we need to remold ourselves, reshape ourselves to become what women desire and stuff. And and that was often this cartoonish and silly way.
Yeah.
And where guys wearing like silk shirts and feather boas out to nightclubs and eyeliner and stuff. But nowadays, I came back to the community and it's like wearing silk shirts and eyeliner is seen as like, oh, this is like effeminate and a sign of like the collapse of Western civilization because of like it's degenerate. And
already the way you describe it, it's such a contrasting view of things, isn't it? The fact that when you were part of this pickup community back in the mid 2000s, it was simply, we as men need to up our game, even though it had currents of misogyny and sexism, as you say. Now you've already alluded to the collapse of Western civilization. That just shows how toxic it's become. It's become polemical. It's become ideological. I've heard you refer to the fact that men before, in this sort of prototype manosphere world, blamed themselves first. It flipped, in other words, to women are the problem. We're okay. We always were okay. Is that a fair condensation of how this has evolved?
Yeah, I mean, there is that element to it. So without wishing to kind of absolve the pickup artist community of responsibility for the way they did objectify women, and all of us who kind of, however much we kind of dabbled in that community, like we were kind of guilty of kind of either engaging in that kind of misogynistic ideology or being willing to overlook aspects of it that were unsavory just for kind of to help kind of progress in that area of our lives. But there still was, I think there still was a distinction between, you had kind of the biggest pickup artist or seduction guru of that era was a guy named Mystery, a Canadian guy who's featured in Neil Strauss's book The Game quite prominently.
And Neil Strauss, obviously a very important figure in all of this. For those who don't know, he wrote a best-selling book called The Game. Yeah,
and this guy Mystery was kind of the pioneer of the seduction community in a way. And one of his catchphrases was, she's not a bitch, she's just a bitch to you, and it's based on like you're doing something to make someone behave like that towards you. And that was kind of like, you would never hear any of the red pill guys today say something like that. Nowadays it would be very much kind of women have kind of gone off the rails because of feminism and the sexual revolution, and I think that is quite that's quite a darker kind of development. It's a distinction worth making, I think, even though that doesn't mean you absolve the pickup artists of anything what they did and the stuff they taught, but it is a distinction worth making, I think.
You talk about the pickup community as having thrived in the mid 2000s, and the only thing I can think of between then and 2015, when populism really started to gain momentum and you had the promise of Donald Trump running for president, and then everything that kind of spiraled from there, was, of course, the financial crisis, after which living standards collapsed, wages stagnated, we had a decade of austerity in this country, and it's kind of against that economic background. A lot of the malaise that is now used to explain the rise of the manosphere and toxic masculinity has been set, which I think is something worth digging into.
Yeah, I mean, there is something to these kind of structural explanations in terms of, so, you have the manosphere attracts guys now who maybe they don't have the kind of relationship they like to have, or maybe they're single and don't have a partner, and they'll log on to YouTube or whatever, or TikTok, and they'll hear these charismatic influencers tell them that, oh, the reason you don't have a girlfriend is because of feminism, because, we've reached kind of the end of monogamy and women are just pursuing this small percentage of like quote unquote high status guys. Whereas, maybe the reason they don't have a girlfriend, or partly of the reason, is because they still live at home with their parents because there's not enough housing for people. Maybe they don't feel like they have kind of much status in their personal lives because the erosion of kind of those kind of well-paying full-time jobs for say working class men or whatever. There is kind of this kind of crisis of it's a bit of a cliche, but neoliberalism at the moment, where in like Britain, America, parts of Europe, Western Europe, or Western and Eastern Europe, you've got this kind of what is men's role in the world. Men have lost status relative to women. There's no longer that same identity as like provider, protector anymore. And obviously that's an evolution. That's not a bad thing that's happened. But it's kind of a period of readjustment for a lot of men, I think, in terms of like what is your identity in the world. Richard Reeves, the author, talks about, creating an identity around fatherhood and for men, which I think is interesting, but many men aren't fathers because they can't get to that point because they don't have the socioeconomic means or whatever to reach that point. And there's also, alongside all of that, there are all these kind of technological things happening where you're seeing the kind of the rise of video and picture-based media. You're seeing YouTube becoming the biggest kind of platform in the world, where all of these kind of the pickup community, the red pill gurus, all of these kind of masculinity entrepreneurs can now promote their wares through video, and it basically replaces TV and circumvents other forms of socialization and kind of goes directly to these young men, often adolescent men, who don't have any kind of media literacy.
You mentioned Richard Reeves, and I happen to have a quote from his book of Boys and Men here. It's sort of in the first part of the book, and he's talking here about the situation in the US, where he says, in 1972, the US government passed the landmark Title IX law to promote gender equality in higher education. At the time, there was a gap of 13 percentage points in the proportion of bachelor's degrees going to men compared to women. In the space of just a few decades, girls and women have not just caught up with boys and men in the classroom, they have blown right past them. In 1982, the gap had closed. By 2019, the gender gap in bachelor awards was 15 points, wider than in 1972, but the other way around. And finally, he says the underperformance of boys in the classroom, especially black boys and those from poorer families, badly damages their prospects for employment and upward economic mobility. Reducing this inequality will not be easy given current trends, many of which worsened during the pandemic. In the US, for example, the 2020 decline in college enrollment was 7 times greater for male students than for female students. I can't help but feel that this is what lies at the heart of it. What do you think lies at the heart of the Manosphere?
I mean, there's more than one thing, but to try and distill it, I mean, on the one hand, there is an element of backlash, an element of men. So men in the past, you know, you maybe didn't have much status in the economic realm, or you maybe didn't have much status in other areas of your life, but you could still kind of dominate your family at home. You still had status relative to women or relative to your family. And so there's an element of backlash. There's an element of, there's an element of, in the past, there was always like a woman for everyone. And now I have to kind of bring more to the table than a paycheck as a man. And some men find that discombobulating. I think maybe all of us in some way find that discombobulating, but there's resentment from that. So that's one aspect of it. I'm not saying that's everyone who's attracted to the Manosphere by any means, but that's an element. There's an element of that, definitely.
I think that is a fair description of what, as you say, most men feel, right? Most men feel
that's the feminist argument for it, and it's not wrong. It's I would say it's just partial. It's partial because there's also an element of men just simply having to readjust to a world where the kind of they're not protectors and providers. It's not, that doesn't bestow status on someone anymore in the same way that it did in the past. But at the same time, we live in a culture where you also have kind of capitalism, entrepreneurs, where they're trying to make you feel insecure. So the Manosphere preys on things that are all, like pre-existing insecurities. So, like capitalism generally, it doesn't just cater to needs; it also can create needs as well. Mm-hmm. So this is something that women generally know quite well. You have cosmetic companies which make women feel bad to then sell them the procedures or the cosmetics or whatever, and that's been going on for a long time. And there's one aspect of kind of equality which tends to mean now that the same process is inflicted on men as well. So if you look at kind of for one example, if you look at the film industry or the music industry, the stereotypical kind of lookist, aspirational kind of figure for a man has become much more buff and muscular compared to, say, when I was younger. Say like Superman or it's just one of these. I forgot his name now. The guy, Chris Hemsworth, for example.
Yes,
it's like these huge, like
compare Christopher Reeve to Chris Hemsworth.
Yeah, and often they're kind of, although they don't tell you that, they're kind of, some of this is kind of a chemically induced hypertrophy. I can't remember how to pronounce the word, but kind of when you get kind of buff and stuff, putting on muscle, and like the male ideal has become almost more cartoonish, whilst at the same time progressive culture preaches equality, but then the kind of the type of model of masculinity you're supposed to aspire to in some ways, both in the economy which is more entrepreneurial, more kind of sharp-elbowed now than perhaps, you know, in the post-war period. And also the kind of cultural figures you're supposed to aspire to are also more cartoonish, more good-looking. And this is a male and female thing. So if you look at the music industry now, a prerequisite for being a successful music artist is being basically a male or female model. Which, like, really, what does that have to do with music? It's nothing to do with music, musical, you know, ability whatsoever. And it's the same with film and acting. We've become a much more lookist society. The more we've become a kind of screen-based society. First with television. Politics is the same. First with television, and now with kind of social media. So, I mean, Gore Vidal, I think after JFK became president, Gore Vidal said, you know, someone who's not telegenic will never become president in the future, which wasn't quite true. But there is kind of like more often than not, the president has to have that kind of telegenic charisma. And it's the same with politicians here, if we look at who's failed and who's succeeded.
Yeah. Vidal also said, never miss an opportunity to either have sex or appear on television.
Yeah, not bad advice.
He understood the cosmetic nature of the modern world, but you're absolutely right. I mean, my heart leaps when figures, particularly like Chris Hemsworth or Henry Cavill, come clean about what it's like to become that hypertrophic on screen, how miserable they get, how difficult it is to maintain, how they have to keep doing pull-ups on set to maintain that buffness. I think Miles Teller, talking about the volleyball scene in Top Gun Maverick, great movie, love that movie. I mean, I'm as much a sucker for that kind of like idealized male physique as anybody. However, he talks about the fact that before shooting that scene, they all had to drink a can of full sugar Coke because he said it created a vascular bulge in the veins. But I think it's a wonderful thing for men in particular when men sort of say, like, listen, mate, yeah, you can get into the shape I was in for Thor, but you are going to be miserable, and I was miserable. So do you want to be the miserable Chris Hemsworth, or do you want to be the Chris Hemsworth who's in decent shape, but is also loving his life? We need more of that. We don't need more of what we often see. And you mentioned film and TV, but this goes for the podcast industry too, right? You must have noticed in researching this book, although you don't call many of them out, just how many of them feed off of that insecurity. Never mind Andrew Tate. I mean, there's loads of them now that are all trying to needle, while supposedly helping men, they're all needling that insecurity at the same time. It's quite manipulative in its own way, don't you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's very cult-like, and it's essentially a sales funnel. So they will make you feel bad about yourself. They will demean you, diminish you, and then come and swoop in with the purported solution. So, you know, you're a soy boy, you're a beta male. We live in this post-feminist world where only 20% of men are going to be hooking up with all of your girls. They'll use, I've heard them use those words. Only 20, you're going to be one of the surplus men where these guys on social media, these elites men, high status males are going to be hooking up with all of your girls. And it's always girls, never women. It's always girls. And if you don't buy my course, then you're going to be condemned like these sexual no-hopers. So, you know, you need to drop $10,000 immediately and I can rescue you. This is the Noah's Ark. This is verbatim. This is the Noah's Ark, they say. And if you jump on now, there's a few places left just for a guy like you. And, you know, I can save you from this.
Take us very quickly through the red pill phenomenon, which then led on to the black pill phenomenon, which then leads on to this notion of surplus men.
The red pill movement kind of is like spawned by the pickup community as a more political, hard-edged version of that. Still concerned very much with this up by the bootstraps of self-improvement.
Yeah, so very libertarian, isn't it?
Yeah, you need to mold yourself into the ideal alpha male. There's like money, looks, game, this kind of thing. You need to kind of go to the gym, get rich, everything through the prison of getting rich. And work on your game, basically your frame control and being dominant and all this stuff.
What's frame control?
The frame control is essentially like being dominant, really. It's like a way of talking about being dominant. So Donald Trump is like a hero in the Manosphere because he's supposedly got like good frame control, which is like any situation he's shaking hands with someone, he's like dominating. Kind of the situation where J.D. Vance and Trump are in the White House with Zelensky. That would be an example in the Manosphere of them having frame control over Zelensky, kind of making him look small, diminishing him.
There are more memes in the Manosphere than we have time to really describe, but the beta line that they draw, superimpose on photos, where if somebody's leaning as they're talking to somebody...
Yeah. Or even if your feet are pointing towards someone.
Yes, that's right, yeah. You're almost genuflecting, or you're submitting to them. Meanwhile, if they stay ran-rob straight... It's almost not worth dissecting it to this degree because there's so much bullshit.
But that's the kind of... so the gurus who preach this stuff prey on male insecurities, but it's kind of brings to mind I think it's the Nietzsche quote, you stare into the abyss looks into you. They end up radicalizing themselves and believing it. So they're always... They get in this like hellish situation from what I see where they have to end up micromanaging their own behaviors all the time because they really start to believe this stuff. Which to me sounds like hell, having to live in that world where that headspace where you're having to think all the time about which direction your feet are pointing in, because otherwise you're a beta soy boy.
I might have interrupted you. You were explaining the history of the red pill.
Yeah, so the red pill is the idea that mainstream society, elites are kind of keeping information from you. So if for those who haven't seen The Matrix, there's an offer. Morpheus offers the blue pill or the red pill. And the blue pill is kind of blissful ignorance. So you can carry on kind of in your, not knowing the truth, but as a kind of a duped consumer or whatever. Whereas if you take the red pill, you kind of learn the unvarnished, harsh truth about the world. And in the Manosphere, that's that, really men are oppressed and not women. That's the supposed truth of the red pill. And the black pill isn't in the Matrix, but it's basically... It comes out of the idea that the incels are the black pill, and they don't really believe in that you can improve. They don't believe in self-help. And it's a lot of guys, the black pill began with a bunch of guys who felt like they'd been ripped off by the pickup community, by scammers, and they weren't necessarily wrong about that. But then they kind of fell into this very nihilistic idea that all that mattered was looks and genetics and how tall you were. You needed to be like 6'5" and a male model, or you're going to like die alone. It's very kind of reductionist. A lot of the incel community began as like trolling the pickup community, and some of it could be kind of funny. Like pickup artists there were loads of scammers in the industry who would try and rip off lonely men, and they'd wear ridiculous outfits to the club and sell their stupid like sales pitches. I remember one. It was like pickup artist sales pitches like make any woman emotionally addicted to you in 15 minutes, and that was kind of par for the course in that scene. And you get these like vulnerable in some ways guys dropping loads and loads of money, and they're just coming out of it without any, they just wasted their money basically. And the incel community kind of started around that stuff, but then they'd taken on the misogyny of the pickup community. But then that kind of was eventually turned on women. So it started off being an anti-pickup artist movement, but then that kind of hatred was eventually turned against women.
So before we forget, we're sat here in Palm Court Brasserie in Covent Garden. The question I always ask is, why have you chosen this place?
I came here with my girlfriend, my partner. Maybe I'm 42 now, so maybe saying girlfriend's kind of a bit juvenile. But I came here with my partner at 2022. We came here a couple times, I think. And it was like a really difficult time in my life. Like my grandmother had recently died, my closest kind of family member. And my girlfriend was very supportive, and it was just like she got me through that period of my life. And we came here a few times, so I just kind of was like, oh yeah, I'd actually like to go back there. And this kind of was an opportunity that presented itself to come back.
I always hope that the guest has some personal story or some real personal reason why they've chosen the place they've chosen. Sometimes they just want to try it out. Sometimes it's just because they enjoy the food, but it's always nice when there's a real memory behind it.
Yeah, and it was during the time when I made a bunch of notes on the book. And I was sort of, part of me was worried. I was in a like dark period. Grief is like not a very nice thing to go through. And I was kind of wondering, is the book ever going to get written? So it's kind of nice to come back. It's like, yeah, I did it, but also it's a collaborative thing in a way. Like I had the support. Like we did it, me and my partner, like she supported me. And it's done now. It's in the book. It's in the Waterstones just down the road, which still feels amazing.
Yes,
like, even if it isn't my first book, but it still feels amazing.
Get yourself down there and pick up a copy. All right. What do you think you might like to order from the menu? I've had a look. I was wondering whether you cared to join me in the Chateaubriand.
Yeah, that's good with me.
Hello, sir. Yeah, I think we'll order the Chateaubriand for 2 people. How would we like it cooked?
I'm like medium rare guy, really, but
Medium rare is fine by me. I'm not like Liver King.
Calling small business owners. Tired of feeling invisible online? Meet Total Solutions, your modern-day Yellow Pages reimagined for the digital age. Whether you're a service provider looking for more clients or someone searching for the right pro to get the job done, Total Solutions connects local businesses with local people. You can list your services, network with other business owners, or even post jobs if you're the one looking for help. Ready to grow your business or find the next go-to expert? Head to totalsolutions.com to join the community. That's totalsolutions.com.
A couple of years ago, I was speaking to Helen Lewis about her Radio 4 series, The New Gurus. And we spoke a lot about...
That was great, I thought.
It was an excellent series, absolutely excellent. And we spoke a lot about figures that now are iconic in the Manosphere, one of which was Jordan Peterson. I've never reached out to Jordan Peterson to appear on this podcast, and though part of me still would, the truth is, I think he is very much a changed figure from who he was when I remember listening to him way back in 2015, before the Kathy Newman interview, before his profile really blew up. And there were elements of what he was talking about, which I think I, in common with other men, saw value in, simply because he was speaking about life's problems in a language and with reference to all sorts of interdisciplinary fields that were attractive, that were unique, that I think departed from the purely rational, which is the way that so many public intellectuals try to frame problems now, that everything that we can conceive of as having meaning should fit within a rational framework of costs and benefits, always taking from science rather than from myth or from religion.
Yeah, I mean, I get what you're saying. I mean, there is very much this kind of positivist, I would say, element to a lot of, and also like that's not even a right or left thing. There is kind of the discourse is kind of about kind of refracting everything through like a prism of like opportunity costs. Yeah, I mean, Jordan Peterson, I think, is someone who's obviously got his health problems, so he's been on and off of antidepressants before, and I think some of those kind of medications or that process has had taken a toll on his mental health. I think that's fairly clear if you watch any of his videos nowadays and compare them to some of the videos he made when he first kind of burst through into public consciousness in the 2010s. I think in terms of to kind of contrast Peterson's appeal to young men, I think one of the reasons for that was Peterson is in some ways like a countercultural figure. So we live in a culture where it's very much about instant gratification. It's very much about take the path of least resistance. Like if it feels good, do it. Like the kind of Jeremy from Peep Show mentality. You know, if it feels good, you should do it. I think Jordan Peterson was emerged partly as a counter to that. So he would talk about, you know, doing things that maybe feel difficult, turning off the pornography, turning off the computer games, doing things that hurt, that are painful in the immediate kind of, you know, now, but which create this sense of deeper satisfaction in the long run. So distinguishing between feeling good and contentment, I think that's very important.
He was almost a corrective, wasn't he, to the Gen X philosophy, which was live for the weekend.
Go smoke some drugs and
do whatever feels
fine,
good.
You know?
Yeah, be ironic and nihilistic. But I think he understood that, yeah, something was happening which was leading us down a path of unbound hedonism, and he wanted to address that. And I think that for a lot of people disaffected with late capitalism, they could sort of sense that all the incentives to accumulate or consume weren't really doing it for them, and the economy wasn't able to really sustain that anyway.
Yeah, and so you have like a lot of Peterson fans and people in that demographic, and I was in that demographic as well. I left university in terms of like my generational trajectory. I left university in 2009 in Nottingham, where it's like this huge like global economic crisis hits, all the kind of the social like. Even before that, you could say the kind of settlements unraveling, and you had a generation before that of people who, you know, through the Thatcherite and Reagan reforms, the kind of post-war settlements kind of unraveling. So you have these kind of promises that are made, this kind of like blasé satisfaction with the status quo. It's kind of unraveling, and it's no longer enough to kind of just coast along. You know, if I spoke to, you know, my parents or grandparents, materially okay by the kind of 2010s, that materially kind of they've got their kind of guaranteed pensions, they've had their kind of free university, their free healthcare and stuff. You can kind of coast along. But then we enter a world in the 2010s and now where that sort of stuff is not really, it's more of a kind of sharp elbowed culture now. And I think someone like Peterson resonates a lot more, where it's like, you can't kind of rest on your laurels. You can't kind of coast along anymore. You have to kind of, stand up straight, make your bed, and stop being a victim. You need to kind of get out there a bit more and put yourself out there and be a bit more assertive if you're one of those people like I was who, I was kind of ashamed of my masculinity when I was younger, and it was kind of, I was afraid of being assertive for whatever reason. And when we talk about like toxic masculinity and all this stuff, that's a very real, like, it's become a cliche, but it's a very real phenomenon. There's a bunch of men out there who are over kind of pushy, creepy, and impose themselves on women and whatever, and it's very unpleasant. But there was also a lot of guys who, and people like myself, I would say, who, our problem wasn't that we were like that. Our problem was that we were afraid to put ourselves out there. We were afraid to impose ourselves on others, like people pleasers. I was a people pleaser, and it's like you're afraid to kind of create like a footprint in society. And Peterson came along as this kind of stern father figure who said, actually, you may have been wronged. You may have been wronged by society in whatever way, but you still need to kind of like slough off that victim mentality and put yourself out there. When he kind of came on the scene, first of all, there was this very strong backlash from the radical left who basically did try to cancel him. And you had kind of him going on Channel 4 News for that infamous interview with Kathy Newman, where there is this sense that, his actual views are being misrepresented. But then I also think that he became slightly deranged, where he sees his allies are kind of people on the right and the radical right, like, increasingly. And so you end up with Peterson, first of all, kind of as this stern father figure initially, and then a few years later he's kind of ranting at paper towel dispensers as woke, and fomenting kind of COVID conspiracy theories about the vaccine and whatever. And also just kind of, if you follow Peterson closely, the things he says on some of these even more obscure podcasts, talking about how like feminists secretly long for brutal male domination. His views on abortion have hardened significantly over the years. So initially he would talk about how, he thinks abortion is regrettable. And then a couple of years ago, he's likening abortion on social media to the mass murder of children. That's quite a significant change in tone, I think.
I think also,
and I think that's part, we could talk about the psychological reasons for that. There are reasons around like audience capture, and he sees his tribe as being kind of the right and increasingly the radical right. But it's hard to explain. It's hard to explain why, get inside someone's head and why he's gone that direction. The guy was in a coma in Russia for a bunch of time to wean himself off of a benzo addiction. So I mean, it's hard to know, but it's depressing nonetheless, I think, his trajectory on that stuff, because he has become just another figure, almost another grifter in the culture war, I would say.
Well, the scale of his fame, I think, would change anybody, and the rapidity of it. I mean, he was old enough, I think, when he became famous to withstand, as age will help you do, that kind of attention. But still, the speed with which it happened, I think, was so, intoxicating. And if you look back at the lectures he was giving and some of the Canadian TV appearances that he was making too, you get a sense for a guy who kind of always wanted to be famous. I think when you look at the way that his trajectory evolved, you've got somebody there who understood that there were certain groups, certain networks, both online and offline, that would really help him and who he couldn't afford to alienate. So you mentioned MGTOW, that's the acronym pronounced for Men Go Their Own Way, which was a group in the early online manosphere that rejected men needing women by default. In one of his early interviews, Jordan Peterson refers to them as weasels, and then later corrects himself, saying that he wants to apologize for that, since after learning more about them, supposedly he no longer sees them as weasels, but as men who actually make very valid points and are very thoughtful. Now, that might be sincere, but I always thought that what he realized was, there are networks of men out there who could be exactly my kind of audience, and I don't want to make the mistake of insulting them I could actually use them and them use me. And this relationship, this client service provider relationship, might actually benefit us both if I befriend them now.
Yeah, and also just like Peterson's like grifter trajectory. If you look at what he talks about, what he says about politics now, where, you know, you had a few years, 2021, you had January 6th, where you have an insurrection. You have people storming the Capitol building. You have basically Trump himself, obviously, and members of the Republican Party claiming that the election wasn't really won by Joe Biden. Then you have people like Peterson kind of equivocating about that and pretending that the real problem, the real threat to democracy and liberal democracy is, quote unquote, the woke mind virus, and still doing it to this day. And it becomes very transparent at this time where you have people like Peterson and a whole bunch of kind of Pound Shop or Temu Petersons doing the same kind of grift, where it's like, oh, well, the real problem now is you have Trump in the White House, but, the real threat to democracy is, just declaring martial law or whatever in Los Angeles. But, the real threat to democracy is is on campus. It just becomes so transparently a grift. And I think Peterson has become, like, he's on his downward spiral now. You can see he's kind of this slightly ridiculous figure. He's not the cerebral Peterson who was on Joe Rogan in like 2018 or whatever, 2016. I think it's 2018 he was on there, where he could actually be interesting. He could actually talk about totalitarianism in Russia or Nazi Germany, and could be a very interesting kind of person to listen to. Now it's all kind of railing against, the wokes on campus and stuff. It just kind of become this like slightly pathetic figure, I would say.
Well, perhaps in memory of the Peterson that we remember more fondly, we're about to tuck into some red meat. But it will be accompanied with French fries. Not very keto. Who cares? So as listeners will remember, we ordered the Chateaubriands. How did you find it?
Yeah, it was delicious. Absolutely delicious. With the papas fritas and the salad. It was really good.
It was excellent, wasn't it?
Actually, that's Spanish. It doesn't really...
No, not quite.
What's the French for...
frites?
Frites, yeah.
That's definitely come here again. You've met many of the people who have been shaped to their own detriment by the Manosphere. What were some of the moments that made you most sympathetic to men who have been drawn into this kind of cultic movement? And the ones where you felt that actually your sympathy couldn't hold up, realizing that they'd gone so far that they were no longer victims of it, but they were part of the problem?
I mean, in terms of the people I felt the most sympathy for, it would be people who I met who came into that space, the Manosphere, the pickup scene or whatever, who was just like incredibly gauche and socially awkward, and who just didn't really have any clue how to kind of interact with people in a social setting. Like, they spent a lot of time indoors, and partly that's people like myself, but I met people who were far worse than where I was at when I kind of found the community, where people who just kind of needed a few pointers, needed kind of a few like conversation starters, needed to just kind of believe in themselves a bit more, people who needed to like learn how to kind of present themselves in a social setting, be a bit more assertive, who just kind of you'd put them in like a nightclub, and it was like throwing kind of me or you into like Vietnam or something, like, the battlefield of Vietnam or something. It's just kind of like petrified. And even just going and saying hello to a woman, introducing themselves to a woman, would just be kind of completely out of their like comfort zone, out of their reality. And they found they were never gonna. Many of those people were, you'd meet people in their like 20s, 30s who like that, virgins, never kind of, they had to do something. Isn't it like, what is it? It's just gonna stay the same. If they keep doing what they're doing, they're gonna keep like getting the same like result or whatever, as the pickup guys used to tell them. And it's like, yeah, I can understand why those people got into the scene because of that. But the thing is, the longer they stayed around that community, the more they would kind of imbibe the misogynistic worldview, the worldview which objectified women and saw women as like kind of notch counts, or notches on your bedpost, and women as kind of trophies, and proof of your masculinity, how many women you slept with or whatever. And the more their personalities would become more like salesy, and whatnot. So, I mean, it was really a radicalization pipeline. You could, that's the thing with this stuff. You can meet people some people who look at these communities like the Manosphere or whatever, could even be like Islamism or the far right or something, and you expect to meet these kind of monsters. It's like, well, actually, yeah, that can be like the destination for many people, but you can also meet people who've just fallen into it as like ordinary people. They aren't exceptional people. They're people like me or you or anyone who just have these like pre-existing insecurities, vulnerabilities, sometimes manipulative tendencies, who then kind of fall into this world and become more and more radicalized and extreme over time.
You've seen Adolescence?
Yes, I have.
You do a great job in the book of exposing the worst products of the Manosphere, from the architects of the movement to its disciples to fringe enablers and apologists. But does going after these characters solve the underlying problems affecting boys and men? Isn't there something more structural we need to fix to get boys in particular on a hopeful path? And that's where I bring up Adolescence, because obviously the release of that series sparked a debate off the back of its huge popularity in this country about how particularly that series could be used to educate boys in schools. I don't think that's going to work. What do you think will work?
I mean, I think showing adolescents to schools is like fine. I'm not necessarily against it, but I mean, it's not going to be some panacea which is going to fix the problem. It would be better if that conversation had been about, well, how can we get more male school teachers? Because we have a issue in schools at the moment where there are fewer and fewer male teachers compared to, say, when I was young. It's for a long time, it's been predominantly women. My granddad, for example, was a school teacher.
Oh, really?
But, yeah, and you don't get, and he was a head teacher, I think, ultimately. But you don't really get so many male school teachers anymore. And when we talk about role models, so on the back of Adolescence, there was this big conversation about role models. But the role model conversation has tended to focus on these kind of celebrity role models. People like Gareth Southgate, for example. And you can even say that Andrew Tate is a negative role model. But I think that there has to be much more interesting, much more productive is a conversation about role models on a micro level. So fathers taking responsibility. So when we talk about when conservatives talk about fatherlessness, it's almost implied that it's somehow the fault of women, that there are more children growing up without fathers, whereas actually, in my case and the case of lots of other boys, and people who are now men, it's because actually our fathers didn't sack up and take responsibility, you know? They had sex and then they fucked off. They left. They fled. They didn't want to take responsibility for their actions. Many of them were in relationships already, in my case, my father's case. It's completely, I hate the way that this is kind of blamed, that stuff's like implied that that's somehow women's fault.
In the Manosphere, you find, male influencers who say, on the one hand, men need to take responsibility. The fatherlessness epidemic is as serious as it's ever been. And that's the kind of conservative view of the fact that the family is so important and that men have a real role to play within the household. But then you've also got men who, at the same time, particularly like Andrew Tate, who say that, men should be polygamous.
Yeah, and there is that thing around, like, so fatherlessness and like, the Manosphere will rail against things like no-fault divorce. So, there are fewer happy monogamous relationships today because of no-fault divorce. Well, maybe actually instead of saying it's the fault of no-fault divorce, it's the fact that women can leave men who treat them badly.
Yeah.
Personally, I think that's a really good thing. I think, maybe men need to step up more in that aspect. And yeah, you can kind of... It's not a case of berating men or, trying to present yourself as some kind of uber feminist and ingratiate yourself with women by saying this stuff. But yeah, there really is a case that, men had it very, too good for too long, where all they have to bring to the table is a paycheck. And even the pickup guys would say this, that, well, nowadays you have to put more, you have to bring more to the table. You can't just be like, oh, I'm just going to work in my 9-to-5 job and bring money. There's no, well, woman has her own money. So now you need, what are you bringing to the table?
To what extent, James, do you think that the problem that a lot of men are having at the moment, and I'm talking not just about those who are sucked into the depths of the Manosphere, but even just your ordinary man on the street, conscientious, listening, but confused nonetheless, is that there may not be a glamorous alternative to the traditional male, but there is an alternative, and it means simply taking part in some of the ordinary adult chores of day-to-day life that aren't going to make them feel like Superman, but will make them so in the eyes of their partner if they are consistent about it and if they just accept that that is what it means to be in an equal partnership.
Yeah, I mean, some of those things are like prosaic seeming, like, you've got to do your share of the housework. Don't just like chuck your washing on the floor and, your mom or your girlfriend's not going to pick it up for you. But I think at the root of some of that stuff is there is like this insidious ideology which says that kind of women aren't quite equal to you, where there is kind of that this permeated the manosphere, which is, women are, men are from Mars, women are from Venus, men are logical, women are emotional. Women are basically like helpers and servants and, breeding machines for like patriarch.
Men are primed to want to go out and hunt, and therefore asking your man to simply pick up after himself is not utilizing his true talents. I mean, that's a lot of what drives this, isn't it? Is the fact that men feel like we're meant to be doing something far more exciting.
It's too mundane for us. And, I literally heard people say this in the manosphere, woman doing some cleaning stuff, and it's like, well, she's just getting in touch with her feminine energy.
It's the Robert Bly Iron John thing, though, isn't it? He wrote this book in the 90s saying that men should step up and be domesticated, that there has to be some kind of conserved space both in the household and in society.
Away from the women, yeah.
Do you think there's stuff there that we can do to help boys by giving them the infrastructure with which to get offline and to become more embodied, more sociable with both men and women?
Yeah, I mean, getting offline, I think, is kind of an existential challenge. A challenge for all of us now. I mean, it feels like the phone thing's getting sort of a bit ridiculous, like Black Mirror-esque. Whereas, like, even now you're having to kind of dodge between people on the street because they're walking towards you while they're looking at the device. I mean, I went during the book. I mean, I went to a Jungian men's retreat during the research for the book. I didn't put it in the book because it didn't really work in the narrative, and I kind of finished the book by that point. But I went to a Jungian men's retreat at the end of 2023 in Stoke Newington with an Irish guy called Conor Craig. It was really good. It was a space where men could it's a men's only like retreat where men like get together with other men over like a couple of days, be very open. Like many of those men who were at that event had never been kind of got in touch with their emotions, been like vulnerable, open before about all kinds of different stuff. It was really good, and there was none of that nonsense about kind of there was none of that stereotypical stuff about feminine energy and stuff. I mean, it was very much focused on getting in touch with your feelings, basically, and being comfortable expressing those feelings around like other men in an environment that felt safe. Because I can't explain why. Because maybe it's like you don't feel like you're being judged by other men or by women. And when there's women present, I think sometimes some men, it's not the women's fault necessarily, but some men act differently. Because it's not the women's fault usually at all, but it's like the men trying to like impress the women or put up a certain facade for the women. But being in that kind of male-only space, it did allow some of those men to like open up a lot more, I noticed over the course of those 2 days. But I think those male-only spaces for stuff like that, those constructive spaces, can be really useful. But that's like a micro thing. I think that was really good, though. Got away. It wasn't like Iron John-esque, which kind of has that implicit, like, male energy is... Like, male authority is important for the community and stuff, and women kind of have to accept it begrudgingly. But, I mean, on a bigger kind of... a more macro level, there are lots of structural things. I think there needs to be just, like... a more public conversation about men like where men derive status, and how men derive how masculine status, what that means. And we need to get to a place as men, I think, where you derive that status from like achievement, from values, from family, from contributing to your community.
You say this is where men should derive their sense of value, but all of those things you mention, achievement, community, contribution. These are all things that the writer's been using to launch a lot of these arguments, right? So there has to be some definition of all of these things that takes us away from the more toxic elements. Maybe it has to come with a different economic argument behind it. Maybe the left needs to step up, even if it means them having to do what the left has been so poor at doing, which is to talk about men as anything other than a problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think the right is very good at talking a good game on personal responsibility, but it doesn't apply that rule consistently. So if we look at, they'll talk about personal responsibility with someone living on a council estate or fare evasion on the tube or something. And actually, I agree. And littering. I agree with that. Like, I do think that all of us, I want to live in a high trust society. Like, it bothers me when I see people evading fares on the tube or littering or just kind of just spoiling the community. I think all of us have a responsibility to each other. But I think the right then, you know, when chief executives of Thames Water pollute the rivers and award themselves like millions in dividends, you don't hear them talking about that. Where's the personal responsibility there? Where's the corporate responsibility there? I mean, you do have some conservatives occasionally talk about it, but not the people in power. And I think, you know, because personal responsibility has to run from top to bottom. I think if we want to create a society where there is this kind of reciprocal element to it, there is this sense of kind of it's not just about, you know, what I can get away with. It's not just kind of, you know, what society owes me. It's also about what you can contribute. I think that has to, like, at the moment, it feels like there's a complete loss of faith in those institutions. There's a complete loss of faith in government because it feels like everybody in positions of power, whether in the government or in the corporate sector, is on the take, is grifting. And that's why I think you have this space of populist politicians like Donald Trump or even Manosphere figures like Andrew Tate who come along and say, well, everything's a racket. Like, this super cynical position, everything's a racket, everything's a grift, but like, if you follow me, I've got mine, I'll help you to get yours. You know, and it's like the cynicism which is created by that loss of trust. It creates this space for these like radical right, populist grifters, Manosphere figures to come along and like prey on that.
That's Lost Boys, a personal journey through the Manosphere with James Bloodworth. James, thank you very much for coming on the Booking Club.
Thank you for having me.